Let me.
That was the wrong intro, and sorry for cutting you off there, Sammy. I did not have it. I thought I had it lined up on the right one, but I had it lined up on background. So I didn't quickly try to find the intro. So, anyway, we're live. How's everybody doing?
Good. I'm glad to be back on. And this is my third appearance on your show, and I really appreciate every time you have me on.
No problem, man. It's a lot of fun. I like talking to smart people, and so it's easy. Anyway,
Yeah,
Sammy, this is your first time here. Well, first time on my
first
podcast.
first time here. Probably first live appearance anywhere.
Nice,
honestly.
nice.
So
tell my audience a little bit before we go live. Let's do some intros. Sammy, tell my audience a bit about yourself.
So I'm from New Jersey. I am a college student. I'm majoring in finance, but my interests are like finance and economics. I got into all this stuff through, I think, reading Liberalism by Mises. Honestly, like I was just trying to learn about like classical liberalism. That was a while ago, and down the rabbit hole, I went to Mises University, 2021, and that kind of got me more into this stuff. And I've just been like, I don't know, just learning, delving into this stuff. I went from like the traditional path, Mises, Rothbard, Hoppe. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. You've been on here several times, but go ahead and just one more time for anybody who might be listening. What's your intro, man?
Yeah. So I'm Peyton. That's my real name, but I'm also Repeal the 20th Century. You can find me at Repeal the 20th on Twitter, and just looking up Repeal the 20th Century on YouTube, Spotify, Odyssey, Anchor, in Substack. Besides Repeal the 20th Century, I'm also somebody who's contributed to both the Mises Institute and the Libertarian Institute, been published a few times by them.
Nice.
And besides that, I'm a liberty activist, and I also work in the New York State Assembly currently. Though unfortunately I can't talk about that on shows, but
Understandable. Will you be able to when you're done? Like when you're done, will you be able to, or is it kind of like forever saying?
So yeah, I can talk about it once I'm done with it. So keep an eye out for that stuff.
I'm looking forward to that. So okay, then let's get into the book. I tweeted out the link. If anybody else wants to tweet out a link, now's the chance to do it. So we're talking about, I put on the shelf, I forgot to bring it back down, but Economy, Society, and History by Hans Hermann Hoppe. It was a lecture series that he gave, and now it's a book, and I gotta say it's a pretty good book. I really enjoyed it. What did you guys think of the book?
Well, I thought it was a really great book too. I think it's a very good intro piece actually into a lot of Hoppe's work, because it's shorter compared to a lot of his other books. And also is all encompassing. It delves deep enough, I think, as like an intro into basically every idea that Hoppe has or expands on of other people's ideas, especially with Mises and Rothbard, and does it in a way that I think is very accessible. And I think that's very important.
Absolutely. Sammy, what about you? What did you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it was my third book I read of Hoppe after Democracy and The Ethics of Private Property. I agree. I really like the structure of like 10 chapters that all connect. There's like one of the chapters is basically like a TLDR of Democracy, the God That Failed. So kind of got a little bit of everything. And I especially like I think the first few chapters, because I think that's the most unique stuff to this book. So yeah, it's great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually did not read the book. I watched the lectures on YouTube because I don't like reading. If I can listen or watch, that's my go-to. And so I listened to the lecture series. Well, that's how accessible it is to anybody listening. Like if you don't like reading, the lecture series is on YouTube. It's very accessible. The only thing I think you get different is it's I don't think you get the questions in the book, and so you can see the charts, because the lecture series is a CD thing, so you don't have any visuals, but you get the charts in the book, and so you actually there's a little bit of difference there. But having a book with you while you watch the lecture series, kind of flip through and go, oh, that's the chart. It's kind of helpful.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I wanted to bring that up actually because it kind of reminds me a lot of I think the book is Property and Freedom or something like that, which is just also a compilation of lectures from Property and Freedom Society, which is Hoppe's own project. And yeah, you can watch all the lectures that are in this book online, but what you're missing if you don't also have like a physical copy of the book. I have a physical copy here, which I got at the Mises Institute at Mises University 2021 as well. Is you're missing the sourcing, but not just that, you're missing the preface and foreword, which I actually think are also really great. They explain the motivation for why this book was published, which is a very good motivation, and in all-encompassing, more right-wing view on libertarianism and the need for embracing the fact that libertarianism is a right-wing ideology and how important that is to achieving our goals. And I think the preface does a really good job of explaining that and convincing you if you weren't already convinced by that.
I'll have to check it out because I don't think I read that part. I think I just read the lecture series. Anyone listening, in the description now is a link to the lecture series on YouTube and a link to buying the book on Mises Institute. And so if you're gonna buy it, then now's the time to go there, pick it up. Also, make a donation. So yeah, Sammy, what about you? Anything you want to add to what we just said about the whole? As we just said.
Yeah, I read the book. I'm trying to remember. I think is it Sean Gabb that does the foreword. I remember liking the foreword.
Yeah, I believe it is Sean Gabb. I'll check real quick for you, so the way we know for sure. Yes, it's on this page. Yeah, Sean Gabb is the one who did it.
I think he also does the foreword for Getting Libertarianism Right, which is another really good foreword.
It's a great one.
Yeah, I have to agree with that as well.
He just followed me on Twitter. I'm gonna try to get him on.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I mean, the foreword in that book is also great, and that book's also another good example of a shorter Hoppe text that's kind of all-encompassing, though it is a little more focused than I would say than this one in what it's trying to tackle and delve deep into, which is libertarianism as a right-wing ideology.
Absolutely. So let's go through this. I think what we'll do is I'm going to read off the title of the first lecture, and we'll go through each and what kind of comment we liked about what we learned, what it kind of covers, and kind of discuss from there. So the first lecture was the nature of man and the human condition. So anyone listening, he just started off, he basically is reconstructing human history with an economic and political lens. So it's very interesting. If you've been listening, if you like history and you want to kind of get the basics of it all, this is a very good book, I think. The first lecture, Nature of Man and Human Condition. What do you guys think of the first lecture? Or first chapter, I guess.
Yeah, so what stuck out to me in the first lecture is particularly something he does in the second lecture, and what the second lecture is really a lot about, which is pointing out about division of labor and how important that is, and how it is like a kind of a bedrock of what made civilization. So he explains the history of humanity really under an economic lens, and how we went from kind of fulfilling every role that we can imagine in early hunter-gatherer societies and stuff, because there was no specialization and there was no division of labor. And it was only until we realized that if we focus pursuits into what a human being is most inclined and is best at, did we create civilization and have that. And that really we got complex languages, we got property itself, and all these other things. And that before then we saw, it in a more primal form that wasn't as productive or did not have the ability of creating the things that it did once we had that division of labor and civilization really came about.
I enjoyed the part when he brought up how he brought up the game theory people who don't know how human beings develop. They question how human beings develop out of competition every day. Like, how does that work with game theory? And he explained it's division of labor, how it's like, well, it's beneficial not to, kill everybody next to you out of competition, to work together. And they also, I said the point about how language came about, when the evolution of language to describe abstract things and like I own this kind of saying really led to the division, creation of property and everything else. I thought it was really, really interesting.
Mhm. Yeah, I have to agree with that, and I think Hoppe does a really good job of explaining history in general. I mean, the first text I read of his, which is the first text of most people, Democracy, the God That Failed, is really just like a history lesson of, or a good portion of it is a history lesson of the organization of governments and the state over time. And then there's a reason why he extracted basically entire chapters of the book into and was able to make it into its own history book, that being Aristocracy to Monarchy to Democracy.
Yep.
And I think he does a really good job here and is able to go even further back than Democracy and ever did.
Yeah.
And I think that sheds a light on an area that is often not covered enough, or covered in a way that makes people inclined to more like left-wing thought about it.
Yeah, something that stands out to me, just of Hoppe in general, is his ability to like apply his theoretical knowledge to history. I think that's one thing he says, is that, oh, historians like are good at like recording the facts, but they're often really bad on history and left wing. And without a way to interpret things, like I think Rothbard said it, that you can't, like, history can't be done without a theory, because otherwise you're just going to be recording like random facts and you don't know what to focus on unless you have a like a framework. So it is interesting to see Hoppe's framework of like his economics, his like political philosophy, like kind of using that lens to interpret like how mankind developed through like property, language, division of labor, all those things.
I read all of Theory and History by Mises, but I read the introduction to the chapter. It just seemed like it was that book what it says, where you learn that book applied to actually reconstructing history, like Hoppe does it. So if anyone wants to hear more about, you can't just read history, you have to like reconstruct history, kind of saying. You need Theory for History. I'd say Theory and History by Mises, especially introduction by Rothbard is probably the best thing you can read on that. Like, that's a really good introduction.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you brought that point up about history and needing a lens to view it, especially because Rothbard himself would call himself a historical revisionist, and because he was very much against the common narratives on most history, which are actually wrong. I mean, especially if we look at just looking at early human history, pre-civilization history. I mean, the common narrative of it is that the reason why we didn't we were hunter-gatherer tribes and very savage and all of this is because we weren't evolutionary developed enough, or we were we didn't have the blessings of like liberal thought or something like that. Those are answers I see all the time of why. And while the evolutionary one, there's some credit to that. It is really because we didn't have a well thought out division of labor. We didn't. That's what brought civilization, was that division of labor, of saying some people are better at these things and other people are better at other things. And we did have a crude kind of division of labor in that was created from genetics, because we see division of labor in other species even, but not as complex as down to you do this task and mostly just this task, and you use your resources, your property, to create more productive ends, that being in goods and services and as we know it. But we saw that with the role of the mother and the father, in the biological sense, that human mothers, even in hunter-gatherer societies and pre-civilization, were the ones that were nurturers and protectors of the home, and men, the fathers, were the ones who went out and hunted and gathered, or are not always gathered, because there would be women who gathered too, but it was always usually close to whoever the docile was. And so I think it is good that Hoppe points that out, that the division of a complex division of labor is the reason why we have civilization, and not these other reasons that like left wingers like to try to say is the reason we have civilization and what holds down civilization.
And what's funny to me is that like the division of labor, I mean, it really comes down to inequality. So it's like the whole foundation of everything is anti-egalitarian in nature.
Mhm.
Like, so it's
Yeah.
just funny to me. I mean, Mises also said that the two reasons for the division of labor being true is inequalities between man and inequalities of like geography. Like,
Mhm.
so that's like the basis for everything.
Yeah, well, and I was actually talking about this in a episode I just recorded with Germinal Van, who is a self-taught economist who's been published with the Mises Institute a few times, and he's from Africa, and we were talking about the common narrative that the reason why Africa is poor is because the lack of resources or colonialism or whatever these reasons are. But we pointed out that the real reason is the attitude, the cultural attitudes that exist, and the geographical inequality, in the sense that Africans on the whole culturally were or have these attitudes of non I'm trying to find a really good way to phrase this without getting canceled.
Yeah, the moment he said
but-
African, I was like, he better be careful. He'll come.
Yeah. But have these attitudes that are contrary to the division of labor. As he says, they're very distracted. They get very distracted very easily, and they tend to put themselves into more of a entertainment route with job prospects rather than productive ones. Ones where they might actually be better than the entertainment route. Something he said that I thought was funny was like, Africans would be insanely rich if what created wealth of nations was soccer.
I like that. Like, the point about, you're getting to the point here, kind of we got to chapter 5 was like the ideology, religion, and biology and environment. Like, this is I think that's my favorite chapter, actually, when he went to different religions and ideology, how they that was really interesting. Also, he said some really, being Catholic, he said some really great things, in my opinion. I was listening, I was like playing a video game, half listening. I'm like, how about Catholic pill? Let's get into that. I was just really listening to some of that, because that was really interesting. But so chapter 1, I think that's the most interesting chapter, honestly. Chapter 1, chapter 5 was probably most interesting, because that was really to go into the base of how civilization built, how we kind of, these norms that we have to kind of get along, division of labor, property came about, was really, and it's interesting. Let's get into chapter 2. How human, that's what I didn't really pay too much attention to. Spread of humans around the world. Maybe y'all want to talk more about that one, because that one I kind of, geography is not my strong suit. I had certain ideas, I just kind of doze off. So if you could.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really interesting. I mean, it plays into the division of labor. He's talking about like different societies and how they like grow and shrink. So it's interesting to me that he's kind of bringing up the point that you kind of need a certain population density before the division of labor can. I'm gonna try to stop just saying that over and over, but before it can take place. And one example that stood out to me is there's like archaeological evidence of societies that used boats to travel to an island. But when that society was rediscovered hundreds of years later, they had lost the ability to create boats. So it's kind of like once a society like is shut off from the rest of the world, they kind of have to just like revert back to more primitive methods, because they can't sustain like a sophisticated society with just like a small amount of people. And that kind of also plays into, I forget what chapter he's talking about, like the growth of cities and how that large populations were able to support like new professions that never existed before. And that's kind of how he had like science and medicine all start.
Yeah. Another thing that Hoppe briefly mentions, and then also in self-promoting again, that podcast that I just recorded with Germano was also talking about, is that a big part of it is the transmutation of knowledge and knowledge being passed on to the next generation. And German will put it, and Hoppe also sort of puts it, is that Africa, for most of its history, did not have much of this. There was not a lot of emphasis placed on the retention of knowledge, especially in a lot of tribal societies, and passing on the knowledge that was gained by previous generations, so it could be used and developed on to continue increasing their pursuits. And so this is the specific example of civilizations that knew how to create boats and then went to islands and forgot it. It's a really good example of that, of how like there was a lot of that going on in early civilization, and still is, unfortunately, in several parts of the world. And that's why we see some cultures and some nations lagging behind, is because they don't have that knowledge pass on. That's a big part of the division of labor and continuing to divide out the roles of people, so specialization can happen.
Yeah, it seems a weird thing to people who would, how to put this, people who wouldn't necessarily. I can think of people who you would say that to, that people you would say people forgot how to build boats, forgot how to build bow and arrows, I forgot kind of thing. People would say that doesn't make any sense. People who would say that probably hold to the legacy of history. It seems it's getting better and better and better. They don't understand. No, you can forget things. And an easy example is if a lot of people can fix a car, they can't fix a car. They're not learning anything. It's a very small example, but it's an example of people not learning what their parents before them knew and your ancestors knew. It happens now. It happened then. It's normal saying. I don't see why people get so weird about. No, that's what I saw somebody say. It was racist that Native Americans did have wheels or something. They didn't have wheels. They were going around and they were like, that's racist. I'm like, no, that's factual. That happened. They didn't know how to do that. I don't know how you can say that's a racist statement, but whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a big marker of whether or not a tribal society will turn into a more civilized society, one that has, grows into the empires and nation states that we see now, and have saw throughout history and have been the most prosperous, is that is there a passing on of the knowledge of previous generations. And in a lot of these tribal cultures that are still very tribal today, or were tribal for long periods of time, you didn't see that. So I think a really good example of this is the transition of the Mongols from just a tribe to an empire. Is that when the Mongols began passing on the ways of war onto the next generation after a few successful conquests, that's when they became an empire, because they were able to amass the ways of war of other cultures, and then also their own. They didn't lose their own ways of war after all their warriors died. They could still go on and train the next generation to be just as efficient fighters and even more efficient. And I can't remember if Hoppe brings up the Mongols in his. I don't think so, but that is a good example that stuck out to me while reading.
Yeah, passing on information. And I mean, that's like a pretty low time preference behavior of saving stuff and just recording it just for the future. So I guess the question is, I mean, a lot of what makes a society successful is time preference. So I guess like the factors that influence it are very important. And obviously that's discussed a lot in democracy. So.
Yeah. I was going to mention something about how religions are really good about that, but I think I'll save that when we talk about chapter 5.
Yeah. Now, the next few chapters are the ones I'm actually really excited about. Is next chapter was money and monetary integration. This is actually where my favorite thing, economic topic, is anything involving money. Like means this is series of money and credit. What's good into our money? Money mechanics about Murphy. Those are my favorite ones. Anything involving money, just like it's so much fun. So what do you guys think of the chapter money and monetary integration?
So I will say that this is one of the chapters in which my interest peaked probably the least, not because I thought it was bad or anything. I still think it's great, but more or so that I've read so much on monetary, and I've never been a huge fan of monetary policy and theory, and I'm just not a big fan of it personally. But I think Hoppe does a really good job of explaining and building upon both Mises and Rothbard's ideas of money, global trade, and kind of also explaining the growth of cities, which I think goes back to something Sammy said about population density in the previous chapter, and how like division of labor becoming complex was a thing we saw at a certain population density, and even more so as civilizations got more and more dense.
Yeah, I think I think I have like two things from this chapter. One interesting thing, I know Hoppe brings up this point a lot, that like when you don't have currencies tied to a like a gold standard, you're basically in a system of partial barter. So he has a quote that's like international division of labor peaked in 1914. Um, so that's an interesting thing that, I mean, that kind of goes with the repeal of the 20th century. There's just been a
Yeah.
constant decline since Woodrow Wilson and World War One and all that. So that was interesting. Basically, like he like almost he would view that we're like declining in the division of labor since then, which obviously isn't a great thing for society. And then another thing that Hoppe mentions, Mises, um, like with the division of labor, basically that because of the division of labor, there's like an incentive for people to cooperate even if they don't like each other. And I forget, I think this is in either liberalism. Yeah, I think it's in liberalism. Mises says that sympathy results from, but is not the cause of the division of labor. So that was an interesting thing of like, you can like hate your neighbor or hate the people, but trade with them. And then maybe from trading with them, you'll eventually start liking them. So I know Mises thought of trade as like the like apparatus of social cooperation and all that.
Yeah. That's a good point that you bring that up, because I'm glad Hoppe expands on it too, because that idea kind of comes from, or at least the first time, the farthest back that I can think of off the top of my head about somebody kind of doing that is Bastiat, or sorry, not Bastiat, David Ricardo in his theory of trade, and kind of the idea that basically you are creating a common goal and a mutually beneficial relationship in trade, and that will decrease the likelihood of conflict. So obviously you're still going to have conflict, because not only is it human, but in trade there's conflicts over, well, I value this this amount and you value it this amount, and those values are not always the same, and you kind of have to kind of reach a point where you're both willing to say you agree on a certain value point for trade to happen. But when that trade is happening, when you do have that relationship, what you see is a more likelihood of peace and cooperation. If we want to ham fist a connection to now, if you look at Ukraine and Russia, and really the West in general post the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was the opportunity, hey, the Soviet Union's fallen, we can engage in trade now with them and feel comfortable in that trade, but we didn't do that. Instead, we continued sanctions, we continued embargoes. I'm pretty sure there are still embargoes and sanctions in place on Russia that started in the Soviet Union. And then we also encouraged Ukraine to engage in that behavior and such. We saw a dividing of two peoples who were very similar, had very similar goals, especially in the geopolitical arena. And a lot of that happened because there was that lack of trade. And really, Hoppe does a good piece about saying how trade, even between peoples who hate each other, does a lot in preventing conflict between them, because it provides another outlet besides war for conflict to happen that is actually in the long run more beneficial because it creates new economic opportunities and opportunities for production. Like I think a good thing would be if actually engaging in a economic war with China that was fought in the market would probably end up doing us more good, because we would have incentive to develop more robust industries and recession-proof industries to combat China in the market.
Yeah.
But instead we, throw tariffs, we sanction, we embargo, and we really limit our domestic ability to produce with regulation and taxation on production.
Yeah, I think I forget what book Mises says it in, but he's like, some people criticize capitalism because it's competition, but he's like, well, it's competition of building things up, whereas war is competition of destroying things. So it's like, which one would you rather have people competing over, like making people better off, or just like killing people?
Yeah, and it is trade. Really, what it is at the end of the day is competition in production, and it's a sort of it ends up being a sort of war of goods, of who can meet who can meet demands best,
Yeah.
and who is really just the best society at producing. And and I think Hoppe does a good job of establishing that, and providing a lot of historical examples in doing so, and also building upon Mises' stuff. I mean, he actually quotes Mises on trade being almost an extension of like Darwinism, and the idea of natural selection.
We gotta get moving because we're 30 minutes in and we're only 3 chapters in. Next chapter: time preference, capital, technology, and economic growth. So, time preference is probably gonna be a topic a lot of you guys both want to talk a lot about. So, what do you guys think of this chapter?
So again, this is a really good one where he stresses the importance of knowledge transfer over generations, and as we said earlier, demonstrates how it's a low time preference action, and how that contributes to economic growth. And he does a good job of demonstrating the it in a Robin and Crusoean economy for most of the chapter, which I think the Robin Crusoe example is
Those
one
are
of the
always my
best
favorite
economic
examples.
Yeah, it's
Whenever
one of the
that
best
comes up in
economic
anything,
examples.
it clicks. Like I didn't actually understand anything economic when I was reading it until once I heard that, it all kind of clicked. I'm like, oh, now I can read, and I started reading more Mises. Like, I didn't understand it now. I get. I can refer back to that analogy. That and the master builder one. Those are probably two of the best ways to explain anything economic wise. Sammy, what did you think of this chapter?
Yeah, from this one, I mean, I had some notes on factors of time preference. So, I mean, 3 things that he mentions for leading to a lower time preference is stability, order,
Real
and
quick,
security of property.
maybe maybe we should define time preference for anybody who might not know what it is yet. Let's kind of find out real quick. Who wants to go forward for that one?
I could try. I'll try.
What was
So,
yours?
yeah, I mean, there's the phenomenon that you will always prefer the same good, all else equal, now than in the future, because the future is uncertain, and if you want it, you just want it now. I'm kind of bad at that reasoning for that, but okay. But the degree to which you value the present to the future can differ, and that is considered your time preference. So a high time preference would be your preference for something right now is a lot higher than something in the future. So you're impatient. So you take $10 now rather than waiting a year to get $100. Whereas someone with a higher or a lower time preference, like the difference in value between now and the future, they're closer to being equal. So you could be like, well, I have a low time preference. I care about my future. Therefore, I'll take $110 1 year from now rather than $100 now. And I mean, that's how like interest rates and everything is formed in an economy. So it's super pivotal. And also, other than economically, it's also super important socially for the behavior. Like a lot of what we think of antisocial or bad behavior, if doesn't really make sense from a long-term perspective, like petty crimes. But if you have a higher time preference and you really want something now, then you're more likely to engage in behavior like that. So it's just very important. Is that good enough, you think?
Works for me. Actually, real quick, before we go forward, I think I have if I can find it. I want to make sure I have a quote here. Well, I can't seem to find it because it's not on my feed anymore for some reason. Oh dang! I had an example. It was of a diet, pretty much a time preference. Like eating donuts is a low time preference, or
high
mess it up. High time. I always get it confused.
I always
my
get it
bio
backwards.
had the wrong one for like a month. It was okay.
I think my bio actually has a reference to time preference. Let me see if it still does.
Yeah, I'm gonna click that and make
Yeah,
sure I
it
get
says
it right.
low time preference individual.
Okay. So low time preference is the good one. High time preference is the bad. We're not going back.
Well, you can't make judgment.
Good, yeah. I have to. Well, for me, I gotta preface that because okay, forget the analogies. I can't find it, so we're just gonna move on. Back to what you were saying about the benefits of time preference. Who was saying that? Was it Sammy?
Yeah, just a tiny bit. So stability and order and security of your property are super important for time preference, because if you're not sure what's going to happen 1 year from now, you're not going to value that. I mean, it's very relevant right now. I'm kind of like freaking out about the whole like economic system right now. Like money being seized, like just like blocking bank accounts, all that. It's like, I don't know, like if you don't know what's going to happen to your money 1 year from now, you're going to just spend it right now. Like you're not thinking about the future because it's so uncertain. And that's what happens in hyperinflation, is people get so uncertain about the future that they just spend everything right now, and that just self-perpetuates the hyperinflation. And that's often how you see economies or societies collapsing, is when time preference suddenly skyrockets because of all this uncertainty, and like loss of stability. So that's why like order is very important for functioning society.
Yeah, was reminded on this subject that Hoppe goes into it a little bit about interest rates in regard to time preference, and how he actually has a graph historically how interest rates have lowered over time, and historically the long-term interest rate has been lower, and also brings that up how really this has encouraged even more and more high time preference behavior, because with a low interest rate, there is more incentive to take out loans, to spend money. There's more liquidity essentially in the market, and you have the incentive to spend, and that creates high time preferences. And then, but also with low interest rates, artificially low interest rates in this case, you have it's de-incentivized to save, because you don't get as much gain from it to save, because one, inflation is increasing, and two, banks, the interest rate on saving is, when it's low, there's less of a gain to saving in general. You don't gain as much from saving. Your money doesn't increase as much. Your investments don't increase as much. So there's a lot. It's like disincentivizing production in saving, but incentivizing consumption, especially of certain goods, of which his student Huysman, who I think is also really great and doesn't get enough attention, lays out in Ethics of Money Production, is really the reason we see the cultural decay we do, why we see degeneracy and all that. Because really, and both Hoppe and Huysman do this, is define that like any definition of degeneracy that does not include time preference is ultimately useless. There is no systemization of degeneracy besides the theological one, of course. than time preference. But really, I would argue that sin and high time preference are both correlated and causated.
I know I probably shouldn't be doing this right now, but I gotta ask. I'm reading the book now as the Money Protestant. I need a guest for the book club. Paige, would you be down for that?
Yeah, I would actually.
That is now 18 books. That's not 19 books on my reading list, but doesn't matter. I'm looking forward to that one because I really
yeah, that's a good book.
I don't like reading, as I said earlier, but very few books that once I start reading them, I can't put them down. That one and Search in the Market by Tom Woods. Those are books I can actually sit and read because they're so good and easy to read.
Mm-hmm.
So, anybody have anything to add to time preference, capital, technology, and economic growth before we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think we can move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Yeah.
Okay. The wealth of nations, ideology, religion, biology, and environment.
Mm-hmm.
This is a chapter I think was probably my favorite chapter. He goes through different ideologies and religions and the effects they have on how people work, economics, capital. I can't remember. Do you remember if he labeled Confucianism an ideology or religion? I remember he talked about people who labeled either one. I can't remember which one he labeled it though. Does anyone have a note on that one? Because
I don't have to
write it down while I was driving.
But I do actually have a lot of notes on, internal notes about his commentary on both Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And I'm really glad you brought up Tom Wood's book about the church and state, the church in
the market.
Yeah, the church in the market, because a reason for why we see Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Christianity in general at the pinnacle of a lot of human development and growth and advancement in civilization is because those Christian religions, particularly Orthodoxy and Catholicism, are really good about the transmutation of information because they have an entire group dedicated to that, being monastics. That is all monastics do, is record and preserve information, and all of their time is dedicated to theological, intellectual pursuits. Someone you've had on before, and all of us know, Marcel Gautreaux, has a really good theory on why the Catholic Church is how it is, and that is that the Catholic Church was really at the height of civilization, particularly in the West, because it was taking in all the autistic sons of people, because in that time, if you had an autistic son, he can't get married. There's nothing else you can do but send him into the priesthood, send him into the monastic order, and so that's what they did. And so you had a high concentration of high IQ individuals who were able to just read all day and create new things and do all these things. And then we saw beginning of a decline in the Catholic Church, and I connect it with the Protestant Reformation, but I don't think Marcel does as much, is when it became more accessible for neurotypical people to be members of society and functioning members and get married and everything. What was left were the other kind of sons you would send into monastic orders, and that being gay sons. And because they wouldn't get married either for obvious reasons, and they were shunned from society and being a normal person of society. So that's what's left in the monastic order and the priesthood of the Catholic Church, as now they can divert themselves into business and stuff, and honestly have a better standard of living in materially, at least. And so, yeah, I think Hoppe does a good job of establishing that with the Catholic Church and Orthodox Church. And
there's definitely something that's a low time preference about, I would say, I don't know, how do you want to classify the difference between Protestantism and the Orthodox and Catholic distinction? Like, do you want to say apostolic churches? Because I mean, there's some apostolic stuff in Anglican and Lutheranism, so I don't know how to really.
I think it's mostly that the importance of the monastic order and clergy in general. That differentiates it in the organization of clergy. So Lutheran is a example of a Protestant or Protestant denomination that I would say overall has a lower time preference than other ones because it also has that to some extent. It's a very lesser extent than Catholicism or Orthodoxy, but it still does.
I would say
I think even Papa mentions that when he talks about Protestantism, is that the more ordered that a Protestant sect is, and the older it is too, the lower the time preference of those individuals tends to be.
I would say fasting, Lent, these kind of activities are definitely a part of a low time preference. I guess culture, you would say, and this kind of religions. Now, I would say there's a. That's exactly what the whole point about having theory. But I keep saying theory when you read history is like understanding how religion motivates people, and when you understand, I hope you understand a lot of like the early America, the Pilgrims, and it's really when you look back at how history works and stuff, and understanding religion is really. Because religion motivates a lot of people's actions, and I think a lot of history doesn't really account for that as well as it should. It doesn't. A lot of stories don't account for the religious motivations that a lot of people have.
Well, I think there's a very specific reason for this, and Hapa has touched on it before, and that is because the establishing order, especially in education, is very anti-religious. It wants to downplay religion's role in society. So a really good example of this is I can remember when I took AP World History in high school, and we talked about orthodoxy, and literally all that was said by my teacher about orthodoxy is that they're Christians that worship pictures. And I was like, at the time, I was like, that doesn't seem really right, but okay. And now looking back at it, I'm like, how did she get away with saying this? And
I'm gonna tweet that now.
Yeah, exactly. But and so the establishing order wants to downplay this, and Hoppe points out that this is ideological, and that if you really want to go after the things that made our civilization great, the things that create production and productive efforts, religion is definitely one of those things. And there is a reason, and most people don't realize this, that Marx talks about religion so much and is so critical of it because he recognizes that it is an important institution in making free markets and capitalism as effective as it is, and also that it plays a role in I don't want to say individualizing society, but like it puts them in a different class dynamic.
It at least like separates them from the state. Just because you have a different like power structure. I mean, I've read a lot about how like Europe was able to develop the way it was because the church was so powerful, and like countering force to like the local princes and everything.
Yeah, I mean, and religion does a big thing in that. I can say, as an Orthodox Christian, as somebody, we create a very community that is separate, not segregating, but separate in the sense that we have our own community and authority that we give to, and the state hates authority that competes with theirs.
Yeah,
and that's why it's one of its biggest targets. Actually, probably its second biggest target. Its biggest target, and I wrote about this for Mises, is the family unit. Whether that's multi-generational families or nuclear families, though I see the nuclear family as kind of a in itself an attack on the family unit by the state, but and it does that through education. That goes back to it. That's actually what the article is about, is how education is.
Either of you guys read was it a compulsory education, or was it Waspat's book on education called? It was
It's like
Education
free and compulsory. I think
Yeah.
it's like education free and
That
compulsory.
book does not get talked about enough, in my opinion. That's a really good one.
Yeah, it is
Like,
actually one of his. It's one of his like less distributed books.
Yeah,
So
I only like briefly saw it.
No,
Yeah.
it's he goes through in the book how Lucifer and Calvin helped create public school because it means
Yeah,
competition for
I
success.
remember that. I remember that.
It was I need to cover that one on the podcast. I was saying because that one does not get talked about. There's so many Rothbard books. Sometimes you forget about books he wrote. Like I completely forget about History of Money and Banking. I just completely forget about Education Free and Compulsory because there's so many.
Yeah,
Great
there's just so
Rothbard
many
books.
things that just got published like after his death.
yeah,
Did you guys one thing I found interesting from this chapter was a bit I mean, he's going through every religion basically, and I mean, he's saying how important ideological factors like that can influence how the attitude towards things such as the division of labor or capitalism. Like certain religions that ban interests just aren't going to do that well, or certain cultures that don't encourage like think of it as greedy if you don't like share everything as soon as you get it with people around you. That's not going to be like conducive for capital accumulation. What's interesting though is he said that early Christianity was very similar to that, as it was like collectivist and not really focusing on the material world because they were focusing on the afterlife or like spirituality. But what's interesting to me is that he said that Aquinas is kind of where like modern Christian view developed, and which kind of viewed life on Earth as good, and kind of like I guess grounded people in like, look, we have heaven to think about, but we also have the Earth, and also I guess that's where like rationality. I don't know. I don't know much about
I
like
would say
the church other than Aquinas, like early church.
I would say early church, it makes sense that they would be like that because like very early church was still hunted and killed, and so they really didn't have a lot to think about. They hide in the caves, and they were. I guess it kind of forced you to not think about the moment. We have to see what others saying and stuff like so. That's my explanation of why they were like that.
yeah,
And when you hide in the kids and living together, you're gonna save a lot more, I think, and that's gonna be a lot more. I know people say early was communist. Like no, they were communal because they wanted to run.
yeah. I was
between communists and being on the run together.
So I agree with what you say about that. It's actually interesting because today is the second feast day of Martyrs that I think explain this very well. So it is the feast days of the Martyrs of I forgot how to pronounce it. Hold on, give me 1 second. I'm going to look at this so I can actually get it right, that I pronounce it correctly. Let's see. Yes, the Martyrs of Sabas. So the Martyrs of Sabas were 40 legionaries who were outed as secret Christians during a time when Christians were still very persecuted by the Roman Empire. And the Roman general in command of them gave them a choice: renounce Christ or die in the freezing river. And so all 40 of them initially got in the river, and then one decided to switch over and renounce Christ. But a pagan was actually so inspired by it that he joined them in the river and was, we say, is baptized by blood, and that he did ascend into heaven. But upon his death, that is. And I think that kind of encapsulates what's going on here, because on the surface, that's a very high time preference thing is, I'd rather die now than renounce Christ and go and live on. But I think that this is kind of where Hoppe his analysis kind of fails, and where I disagree with him I disagree with him a lot on the early church, and I think he's kind of not recognizing that it is a low time preference actually option there, because the believing in Christ, it is that you are actually getting the long-term pursuit of heaven and eternal life by doing such, and that actually they were making that decision. So I think it's a thing that he's approaching it from a secular lens when you can't do that. And I do, though, agree with him that Aquinas very much shaped the modern Christianity as we know it. But I don't think that's all good, unfortunately.
I wish Aquinas had, honestly. So my thing, I wish Aquinas had more of an impact. Because a lot of Protestants that I know don't like philosophy and get mad when they do philosophy, or get mad when they try to apply reason to faith. And I think Aquinas really was the example of bringing faith and reason together. I wish that was prioritized more by a lot of. There are Protestants who do that. There are great Protestants like William Lane Craig and I think Cooper, the Lutheran guy, Cooper, I can't remember his first name. I wish there was more of a thing because there was some Protestants who are very anti-philosophy, anti-reason, faith alone, but not in the faith alone, obviously in the solar way, but also faith alone in the extra reason philosophy way.
Yeah, I went to like a Lutheran-esque like high school-ish thing, and we had to do like Aquinas and Augustine. So I think that's like a Lutheran thing, I guess. What was I gonna say? Yeah, that was interesting to me. And I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that like Hoppe is just doing an analysis of the physical and of the material.
Yeah.
And we're not like, it's not implying that society is worse or better. Like I would argue that like material things are like of second importance anyway. So that's like important to acknowledge. Like a society can focus on things other than material well-being. This is just a theoretical explanation for what societies do well materially. And I mean, Hoppe's secular, but he's also just not delving into the ethics here either. So
yeah, I actually think Hoppe would agree with that too. Just based on him being more right wing and implying how important like order and these higher ideals are to society, and that it isn't just the material production, but it's that in here, especially in his analysis of religion, that he's putting way too much emphasis on the material. And there is a reason for that. He's doing a more of an economic analysis, but I think it's blinded him a little bit and also created a blind spot, because especially in that he didn't look to Eastern Christianity, Orthodoxy more, because we developed very differently, and we had our own kind of Aquinas, except for I forgot the saint's name, but
I thought I'd ask you what his name was so I could write it down.
Yeah, I know. But we had our own kind of Aquinas, but the separate is that we rejected the idea of applying reason to faith, and that was our big split in our development from Catholicism, was that we didn't want to apply secular things to faith, but we can't apply faith to secular issues.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'm not gonna. I put this. Honestly, orthodoxy wise, how did you think? Based on the wisdom we said about how Catholic stuff develops economic wise, how did orthodoxy, you think, affect time preference wise and development wise in different countries? How orthodoxy affected? Like we talk about Catholic, Protestant. He didn't really touch orthodoxy. How can you tell me kind of how orthodoxy affected economic growth in different areas? Or
so I think orthodoxy actually, if we're going to talk about in the issue of clergy, kind of insulated itself from the problem that happened with Catholicism, in that because our clergy could marry, and even some monastics can marry, though that doesn't happen very often. That is a lower time preference, because as we know, having kids and getting married lowers time preference. Those are things that we know. This is actually one of the things that got Hoppe a lot of fire at University of Las Vegas, is when he was explaining that homosexuals have a naturally higher time preference because they cannot have their own biological children. And so I think orthodoxy did a lot of that, insulated itself from that. But also, plus, I mean, if you look at Greece and Russia and a lot of Eastern countries, their entire development was because of orthodoxy, because orthodoxy was so ingrained into the cultures, the lives, and even the governments. And in all those countries until specific events. So with Russia, it was the October Revolution and the martyrdom of Tsar Nicholas and his family. and that cut orthodoxy off. And I would say actually that's one of the contributing reasons for why Russia did so poorly, is it lost a lot of this transfer of knowledge in these institutions that had an orthodoxy for growth and for the division of labor to really flourish, because it just cut itself off from one of its most important institutions for doing so.
Well, an hour in, we only covered 5 chapters. Let me ask you guys, do you guys want to do a part 2 next week, or do you want to continue?
I'm fine with doing either. I think I don't know. It's up to whether or not you want the viewers want to watch a 2-hour long video or 2-hour long videos.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the last 5 are shorter. Maybe we could do it in like 30, but yeah, it's up to you, Caleb.
I'm gonna say let's power through. Let's power through and get the next one's done.
Yeah, you need your Elden Ring break,
Well, the game downloaded, and I made my character, and I saw the time, was like, I gotta stop. I beat the first, I died to the first, but I beat the second boss, and I'm like, actually way to play, and it's calling my name. Okay, production of Law and Order.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Does anyone have anything you want to add to that last chapter before we move on?
Yeah, one tiny thing, and I'll just do it briefly because it could get controversial. It was interesting, basically success and linking it to IQ, but it's not directly linked to IQ because there can be anomalies, and Hoppe attributes that to ideology. So you could have people that are overall very smart, but if they're following an ideology that's not good for material well-being, then they're not going to be.
Or they're really smart and they're in a community full of people who follow the ideology.
Yeah, so I think China was his example of an anomaly where they have very high IQ yet a very low GDP per person. So I mean, I have kind of thought about what is it that in the ideology that lets these super authoritarian regimes stay in power for so long. So it's just interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think
I need to read more Confucianism and all that kind of stuff, because the earliest anarchists from China, and so it's kind of weird to see the earliest anarchists and then originated in China, Taoism, and then compared to what China is government wise, it's always very counter to that. And I think it's honestly because that first guy would not take a job in government. They offered him a job to come work in government. And imagine the early Chinese government had an anarchist as the head advisor. He said no, and he wouldn't get involved. And now we look at China. China's just been downhill, going terrible. And so, anyone anarchist listening, you should be involved in these kind of hierarchies and the elites, because you actually make a difference.
Yeah, I wanted to add on quickly since you brought that up, because I thought it was a good point and something I was thinking about, is that IQ high IQs and high average IQ can help really bring a nation and increase growth, but Hoppe does a good job in saying that it's only one piece of the puzzle, and the more important part of the puzzle is the guiding ideology, and that we can see that with China. We can see that with Russia actually too, and also just I think a counter, a reverse of it, is that low IQs and high production because of the ideology. A good example would be South Africa in under British rule, because it had a very low average IQ, or actually better yet, Australia had a very low average IQ in its inception, and yet it saw such a massive growth because of the ideology dominating it, which was a more liberal, at least when it comes to markets, liberal ideology and in a respect for property rights, especially over the tribes that ruled Australia beforehand.
Very interesting. He didn't touch at all on India. What's the word? Is it Hinduism? Is that the one in India? I always get Hinduism.
Yes.
Did he touch it all on Hinduism? I can't remember if he did.
I don't think he did, which was interesting considering it's one of the largest religions. Let
me see. Actually,
his
who's that? I know there's an Austrian economist from India who pops up on a Mises Institute every once in a while. Anybody know his name?
Oh yeah, he did actually talk about it.
I
But
have a quote. It says, "I will begin with one of the religions that is comparatively bad when it comes to capital accumulation, intentiveness, and so forth, and that is Hinduism. Hinduism is
yeah,
characterized as far as economic doctrines by explicit taboos against certain resources."
yes,
That's a good point. That is a. I remember James Burnham wrote about how India could solve a lot of its problems if they started killing cows, and that got a lot of pushback in India. Like there was like newspaper articles saying Mr. Burnham wants to kill our icons or something like that. I can't remember the exact phrasing of it. But I think that's an interesting point. But like when you have religions that value certain material goods like that to a point where not in use, but in just like in protection of them, that's going to be a major effect on economic growth.
Mhm.
yeah,
Okay, then. If anyone, I think is that it for everybody on this chapter? We're gonna move on.
Yeah,
yeah. I think we can move on
Got it.
to.
And the next one is production of law and order. I really have nothing to add to this one. So if you guys just want to go right ahead and take it.
I'll just give like a note I had because maybe Peyton can answer it. Is I mean, Hoppe is probably the first like author I've read to have like a positive view of like the feudal system. Kind of like that was kind of new to me when I started reading Hoppe. So that was interesting to see, and I thought it was interesting. I'd want to read more about it. He said it largely consisted of contractual relationships between landlords and tenant farmers. So almost like I mean, Hoppe would view it as like proto private law society, like the closest thing we had to it, and that um like land tenants were like had obligations to their prince, and then princes could have obligations to like bigger land ownerships, but it was kind of like a decentralized web of hierarchies. So that's just
Mhm.
interesting to think about. And that was like defensive alliances, and I mean back then we didn't. I mean there were still a lot of wars, but they were less of total wars a lot of the time. Because
Yeah. So I actually have a lot to say on this one,
nice.
Please.
because my area of study is law, and I studied, my concentration for my major is actually law in institutions, and I very much agree with Hoppe's analysis of that. Really, feudal systems were these proto um, anarcho-capitalist, proto-private law societies, because they were a very contractual relationship. If you were a serf, you actually did agree to certain terms, and if you did not agree to those terms, you would go and seek another lord, or leave the land and move to another lord's territory. Um, because you didn't agree to the terms, or you didn't like the new terms of whoever was the new lord, because it was a very dynasty kind of thing. But we also did see wars, but these wars were very much seen as disputes between lords, and ones where most people did not get involved in them. Most people were completely unaffected. In fact, most people did not even know these wars ever happened at the time. You could like go to a town and be like, who's this is Lord Farquaad's territory, right? And it's like, oh no, actually, a war just happened, and it's now Lord Tybalt's territory now, and that would happen a lot. People's I think he mentions this in either in this book or in another book about the Italian city states, which is a further development of that, in which your who was ruling you was constantly changing because of either contracts were changing, there was new engagements, citizens no longer agreed to these rules, or the rules changed and the citizens disagreed, so they moved under the territory of another. And I find it really interesting because it is literally just a market for law in these early societies. It was a market for governorship, and it worked really well. There is the narrative and this goes back to kind of ideology and stuff. There is the narrative in the education field that this was like a horrible time in human history. We lost so much knowledge and we went backwards in technological development, but none of that's true. The reason we call the Dark Ages is because we have very little like paper records of what happened, but we had a lot of oral records, so passed down through monastic orders particularly, of what happened during this time. And that's where most of our knowledge comes from, is these passed on oral traditions. And really the standard of living was not horrible, and in fact, most serfs had complete lay of the land. They were doing things that their lord never even knew about, because their land was just so big, and they were just kind of allowed to experiment and do things that they couldn't do in these more centralized empires and kingdoms around them. And that really the feudal system was, I'm not going to say it was better standard of livings now. No, obviously not, because the standard of living is actually higher now. But it was not because of feudal systems that it was lower. It was the development of technology.
Yeah.
Technology gets better, your life gets better. And I would say the development of technology has been in the spite of our change in governance, not because of it. And I think Hoppe does a good job in establishing that too, in this chapter particularly. And that even further so, feudalism was a division of labor amongst governance, in saying like, so with kings especially and monarchies, they would say, you're the best lord for ruling over this territory, and you're the best lord for ruling over this territory, and basically created a division of labor for governance of a region too, which goes on to the development of the division of labor and civilization in general.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then he later in the chapter, he goes on to kind of like extrapolate this to the present with like insurance companies and the whole thing. Of course, very very libertarian, the whole insurance companies running the world. Funny
I want to point out the point about, you mentioned about the war and stuff and total war. It's what's interesting to me is like how much worse war was gone, and it's not to do like technology, but it's like who we're targeting. If anybody want to read more about that, Eric Von could I can never say his name. Eric Von something Ledin has a great piece called Monarchy and War, and it's in Hoppe's Myth of National Protection. I think that's the one.
Myth of National Events. Yeah,
a great one.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because I did want to expand actually on that. So why we didn't see total war, and why wars were less catastrophic, and it was because the results of war were directly tied to those waging war. So nowadays, Democratic politicians have very little consequence when it comes to war, especially with the wars that America wages, because all the destruction happens, continents away, and miles and miles of sea and way, and because they're of the higher class, their sons aren't going to be drafted. They can get them out of the drafts, and so they have very little personal consequence to what happens. But in feudalism and monarchy, absolutely not, because the value of your estate would often decline in war if the war became catastrophic or totaled. And you really, really, really did not want to destroy territories of rivaling feudal lords, because that would become your territory if you won. And then you would be stuck with all the debt and the costs to repair that, the institutions that were destroyed and the buildings that were destroyed. And so there was very much an incentive against total war in making sure that war was separated from really the daily lives of the productive actors, that being like serfs and farms and all that, and that war would take far, far away from that. And so you saw very few civilian casualties, even in the most costly feudal wars and monarchical wars of the time. Civilian casualty rates were far lower than modern wars and modern warfare, in wars between democratic states.
Yeah. I think passports were created so that civilians could just go visit other countries while the
Yes.
countries were at war. So
Did not
like
know
stuff
that.
like
Wow.
that is pretty crazy. It's just like, yeah, back then it's like people weren't so tied to like a nation or like a collective, which is helpful. I had this post on Twitter that for some reason blew up a bit, like down like criticizing economic sanctions on Russia, and all the comments from like I don't know, like boomer conservatives are like, "Oh no, the Russian people decided to go to war, therefore we're gonna like crush them all." And I'm like, yeah, it's sad
That's
that I
some.
kind of used to think like that in like
Yeah.
collectives and stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought that up because before we started recording, I put out a tweet. There was a Rasmussen poll that broke down
I saw that.
voters' support for U.S. military intervention in Europe if a full-on war breaks out, and the lower the income of the person, the less likely they were to support it, and that's for a very obvious reason. If you're a lower income, you're more likely to be drafted, you're more likely to have someone in the military versus higher income people. You're also more insulated from the costs of that. So, obviously gas prices are going to rise because of our policies. They're already rising if you look at them. Um, and the costs of goods are going to rise in general, which was another reason that feudal lords and monarchs were more less likely to both wage war and wage costly war because
Mhm.
they were not insulated from these prices. Even though they were rich, they still had to purchase from other feudal territories. They still had to purchase things, and that's because the taxes were their money. It was their money that they were producing. It was their production. It wasn't just this arbitrary. It's the nation's money. It's the people's money, or whatever. It was your money that you were spending to do this.
Mhm.
And so they were not insulated from costs and the purchase of goods. And furthermore, it brings up a good point of how also under feudal lords and it was much easier to get rid of your ruler
Mhm.
because you can appeal to another ruler, or it's easier to start rebellions, revolutions, all these things because the people are more conscious. They recognize that they're not a part of the government and that this is a separate entity from them,
Mhm.
and that and they don't think that, oh, I can just vote my way out of this, or I
Mhm.
am the government. So rebelling against the government would be pointless because I'd be rebelling against myself. These mindsets did not exist.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. One of the points. This is not point Hopper makes in this lecture. At least I don't think. This is the only. I want to skip one lecture, and that was this one. Eric von Knut then makes a point about like propaganda and wars under democracies. They have to convince people to support the war, and so they can prevent rebellion, to justify sending sons and daughters, to have a lot of propaganda in the war. And he tells a story about how apparently the French government in World War One, when was World War Two, World War One, had propaganda that German soldiers stank worse than French dead soldiers when dead. The German soldiers smelled worse than French soldiers. The dead Germans smelled worse than French soldiers. And other stupid kind of propaganda like that. That when World War II happened, and said, hey, the massacre and the Jews in the Holocaust, no one believed. The French didn't believe it. The French
yeah,
did not. A lot of French people did not believe the Holocaust was happening. A lot of other things that were being said because they propagandized and lied so much during. And what these, to my knowledge, I don't know about a lot of stories about the governments and feudal and monarchy sides propagandizing their populace and the serfs under that system, because that really wasn't. They didn't play, like you said earlier, they didn't have the same level of role involvement in the wars between the elites, the
yeah.
lords.
Propaganda was also very difficult for two reasons. First, it was harder to reach the average serf because one, they can't read. Two, there isn't a lot of mass communication technology. The only communications were person to person, or writing letters. And so it was far harder to get people on board for things or to manipulate them because of that. And then also the second reason was because there wasn't as much of a need of it. So people would support wars if they thought that the Lord was going to prevail, if they were going to win, and there was a benefit to come. And a lot of serfs liked when wars were won or when they were waged, because they would have more land to use. They would have more land to expand on, and people often got bigger homes. They got more farmland. They got a greater area to experiment with. And so, in that way, feudalism was, or the people of feudalism were kind of pro-war, but that's because they were insulated from the effects of it for the most part. The only effect that they ever saw was they had a new lord. That was it. And if most of the time serfs didn't really care unless they were being taxed at heavy rates, or their lord was waging total war.
So I think we're going to skip the chapter on state, war, and imperialism, because we kind of just covered a lot of that, I feel like. So there are these few more chapters. Next chapter: Partisanism and the origin of the state.
Yeah. So this is a really good chapter because, so ever since Mises U, after listening to Ryan making in personal conversation with him, and then also his lectures, I have stopped kind of saying the state and saying the modern state. And Hoppe does a good job in this too. I don't think he uses the term modern state, but in saying that, there were states. There's always been states, and there kind of always kind of will be, because, you can rationalize it that even a private law society, that's a state. Or, but the difference being in that the modern state became an entity that was very detached from personal and private connections. It became one that had this thought of the government is greater than me, and I'm a member of the government because I vote and I'm a citizen and stuff like that. And it really changed and flipped and changed what it meant to be a state. So in that sense, we are anti-state. That is correct. But the difference is that it is this new, more modern interpretation of what the state is. And I think Hoppe does a good job of talking about that, and how the modern state is more of a parasitic organism than other states, because it does not produce itself. It only takes from the production of others. So like in feudal systems, and even the Roman Empire, they would produce goods. They would actually produce things and create things. I mean, the Roman Empire created aqueducts. It created these things and did real infrastructure projects that came out of their own money, not taxation. Came out of money they earned and from selling and engaging in production. And the same thing with feudal lords, and they would sell land, they would sell goods and all these kind of things that were their own personal money. But then with democracy, the modern state, liberalism, all these other things, the state became detached, and that taxation became the primary source of income for states, for governments, and that changed them from production to parasitism. And he does a really good job of explaining that and talking about how, the states went from something that was semi-voluntary to something that was not voluntary at all, and really a parasitic relationship on productive actors.
One thing that stood out to me was kind of the idea that liberalism, like in the terms of like markets, is like so successful it leads to its own downfall, because once a society gets rich enough, then there's a large enough incentive for a group of people to come and exploit, because the parasitic class can only ever be a small percent of the productive class. So it's like there's no reason to rule over a people or exploit people if they don't have resources for you to take. And then the other interesting thing I got from this chapter, other than that, was he explains the process of going from like semi-voluntary, like monarchical systems to like absolute rule by one monarch. And it's like, and I have a quote. It says, the decisive step that he must take in order to transform his position into the position of a state would be the following. The king at one point would have to say, from now on, you must come to me whenever you have a conflict with somebody else. You can no longer go to anybody else for conflict resolution. And it says, up to this point, you chose me voluntarily to be the judge. Now I take away this possibility from you. Which, I mean, kind of goes with the Hoppe Rothbard definition of the state, where it's the coercive monopoly on justice and stuff. So, like, before, people would choose your lord based on, like, who's going to defend you and who will give you the best system of life, whereas it turned to, you can only come to me.
Yeah, I think that's also a very good point, because something we saw with feudal systems, monarchical systems, is that you could go somewhere else if you didn't like the decision of a certain judge. You could go to another judge or another lord and for conflict resolution and say, hey, I don't think this was correct, and and also that was the role the king played in most feudal societies. So he would solve disputes between lords, and he would be the arbitrator basically for that. And if one lord was not satisfied with the outcome, if he did not arbitrate this outcome well, that lord would betray the king and go to another king. And you would see that a lot with society, was when kings made bad decisions, when lords made bad decisions, they lost power, and they were directly harmed by it. So they had an incentive to make good decisions, because the consequences of making bad decisions were pretty catastrophic for them. But you don't see the same thing with democratic politicians or democratic governments, because the consequences of their bad decisions, they're mostly insulated from, because even if production decreases, they still get subsistence. As long as production happens, they are sustained. It doesn't matter if the production keeps decreasing. It's only when the parasitic class grows too big, or there's basically just no production at all. And that's when, the parasitic class either gets destroyed or it is replaced with a new one that will probably guide it in the right direction for a little while, so production can build back up, and then it falls back into the same cycle. And Hoppe does a really good way of explaining that and touching on that and the origins of that. And I thought it was really good that you brought up about liberalism, because liberalism, in the terms of markets and economics, really does create its own destruction because of allowing this parasitic class to develop, because it makes life better. It makes it easier. So there's a movie called Idiocracy, which I don't know if you guys are aware of.
One of my favorite movies.
Pretty popular movie. So Idiocracy, it kind of says that because of the advancements in technology, it has both de-incentivized people from having children, especially higher IQ people, but incentivized lower IQ people to have children, and also keeps them alive. It kind of cuts off the natural selection of the division of labor, because at the end of the day, people are less likely to die from injuries, they'll live longer, and all these other things, and that in turn creates the decay. So I think we're kind of seeing that now, where we've created all this prosperity, and now this prosperity is backfiring it, because it's creating higher time preferences, and it's incentivizing bad behavior and disincentivizing good behavior, and getting rid of the consequences for bad behavior as well. Even if it wasn't incentivizing bad behavior, you would still be seeing a lot of it because the consequences would be less and less and less.
This is a point I made on Adam Nutta's podcast a few days ago, is that one of the things the state has done is it's not as a state, but how to put this, it's basically modern medicine, that kind of stuff. You're less likely to die young or die from a stupid mistake. So you kind of have people are not as safe as they should be, and the government itself has taken basically filled the gap and government is taking away people's responsibility for their own actions now. A lot of people have, like, if they fall back on the state, they have the state is making people less responsible for their own actions by getting involved in welfare checks and safety nets and all that kind of stuff. So people are not as responsible for their life, their actions, or anything now. And even in the government, a lot of people don't do charity work now because the government's got involved in not only regulating charity, but something. I listened to a guy about a bad business practice, and he said there's no way that that's actually happening, because if it was happening, the state would outlaw it.
Yeah.
And it's just
the
like
moral
people,
hazard.
yeah, it's like the government's got a lot of people that don't have people don't play active roles when they consume, or they don't really take an active role in the market, hoping to get rid of bad business practices. Sorry, I'm running off for 2 hours of sleep, 4 hours of sleep, and I'm getting a little exhausted here.
Gosh.
Yeah,
we
last few days
could
been a mess.
probably get to the next chapters. Honestly, 8 and 9, I don't have that many notes. We kind of discussed 9 already. That was like on war and like total war.
And does anybody have anything you want to add to monarchy, or from monarchy to democracy, or do you want to jump right to the strategy section?
I have one small thing on monarchy to democracy, in which I think Hoppe touches on a little bit on how democracy is a little more general than people give it out to be. So even things that look like monarchies or kind of like monarchies, so like dictatorships and stuff, are democratic in effect, in practice, because they have a lot of the same incentives. Because even a dictator is still someone who detaches himself from the country as a state and views himself as a benevolent leader who is detached from the consequences of his bad policies, because he is parasitic as well. And so I think that is something that a lot of people don't talk about and should be talked about more, because it's something that, like, people who are critical of Hoppe's ideas hit him on, is like, oh, well, look, we have these dictatorships or monarchies that are, behaving just as badly as democracies. And that is because, in effect, they are democracies. They have the same views as democracies in terms of governance and in practice. So,
Sammy, you anything you want to add?
Not that much, honestly. I think that was a good system. The notes I have is kind of similar to the whole process of from like a prince transitions to a king, like of ultimate authority, and then Hoppe goes through the whole story of like the intellectual class that the king uses for support eventually turns against him to like form what we think of as the modern state. So that was just interesting. Yeah. But that's it.
Okay, last chapter: strategy, succession, privatization, and the prospects of liberty.
Mm-hmm.
So, if anyone wants to really hear some Hoppe's strategy stuff, what must be done is a lecture he gave, and I was thinking it's a pamphlet now, a sort of book on Mises Institute. And I talked about that with I came up with some Irish channel on YouTube a while ago. I'll put in the link in the description. What do you guys think of this chapter?
So, this is probably my favorite chapter. And the reason why it's my favorite chapter is because I put a lot of emphasis on strategy. I think strategy is really, really important. I think it's something that libertarians don't talk about enough. So libertarians were really, really good about giving our policy prescriptions. We're really, really good about giving the theoretical thing of why we believe this and the ethics of it. And we have thousands, I would say, probably at this point, books on the subject. What we don't have a lot about is, how do we actually achieve this? Mm-hmm. How do we actually put this into thing? Of those, I could probably list them all in about 10 minutes, maybe 10 minutes or less. And so I'm really appreciative of whenever we get these and when it's good. And it is very good here because Hoppe talks a lot about it is a lot like his pamphlet What Must Be Done, and talking about secession, privatization, and the strategy of actually accomplishing things, because really our strategy should be decentralization, radical decentralization, decentralize as much as we can our institutions, because that keeps them from it's harder to subvert a decentralized institution than a centralized one. And because there's a lot more to subvert. So an example I give of this, and you might not like it as much because you're Catholic, is the papacy versus the Orthodox organization of clergy.
Now, before we go further, remember this: I'm allowed to debate this topic. You're not allowed to debate this topic. So
true, yeah. So I'm gonna avoid going into debating it. But so the papacy, you have the Pope. He's the supreme authority. So that's one person you could subvert. In Orthodoxy, our supreme clergy members are our patriarchs. But we have multiple patriarchs. We have a council of patriarchs. Every Orthodox sect, if you want to call them, they're not different enough to be sects, really, in my opinion. And we're in communion with all other Orthodox, except for, I think, one brand of Orthodox, and I forgot the name of it. But each one has its own patriarch, and then below that there's metropolitans, and then below that there's archbishops, and below that, and it's very decentralized, and it's harder to subvert. And that's why I think in a lot of ways Orthodoxy has been able to stay as consistent as it has, while you've seen changes in the Catholic Church. And this is not to knock Catholicism.
I'm 100% agreement with you on this. Like I was calling it a bit more decentralized. Like my politically speaking, like politically not like politically speaking, like accent wise, but like how things are organized. Orthodoxy is much like, again, I'm Catholic. I think it's true. I wish Orthodoxy. I wish I could be Orthodox. Was for how to put this. Everything about Orthodoxy, I like the structure of it all. I wish it was, in my opinion, true. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't agree with the theology of it. And I know. The structure of it, I'm 100% behind. So
I want to specify: do not become Orthodox because we have a decentralized clergy. Please don't do that, because that is not a reason to become Orthodox at all. And trust me, you will very much regret your decision. And this is coming from somebody who is Orthodox saying this, but. That is just an example of it. And Hoppe really stresses how important it is to be subversion proof, to be you're not going to be 100% subversion proof because that's impossible. There are always going to be bad actors, and there are always going to be grifters, and they're always going to get into your movement somehow. But what we can do is build institutions that are decentralized, in which a bad actor isn't going to mean too much. And he applies that a lot to the political process and how important it is to be working from the ground up, in terms of starting at very much the local level and moving up state and then federal, and it'll trickle up. It'll be trickle up economics in terms of political strategy.
I found it interesting, like the whole his whole it is the whole what must be done strategy of kind of like taking over a local area and then like imposing new rules, like basically make it harder for outsiders to make change. That's like preventing subversion. Like there's kind of the phenomenon that if you do too well and then people just flood in, then it just like that. I think that's even happening may happen on a small scale with places like Florida and Texas. Is if it does too well and enough people can just move in. Like there was that, who was that? Was that MTG saying that there should be like a 6-month gap on when you can vote once you move to Florida or something like that, or Georgia? I forget who said that, but that's kind of a Hoppian idea of like basically like once you basically essentially you're just privatized a small town for all intents and purposes, and then the idea is like obviously 10,000 Liechtensteins.
Yeah.
I think I like how he focuses on having like a good character. Basically, he's like, like I think he kind of downplays not like the massacre, but like the people themselves of Waco, if they're kind of like a bit like
Mm.
religious fanatics, so more people could like understand why the government would do something like that. But he's like, if we're just like respectable people that have done nothing bad to the people around us, we've like built relationships, like we're of high moral character, then you're almost like protected by public opinion. I
You
mean,
can't be
not
too
entirely
insulated.
because of propaganda, but
Yeah.
if enough people are willing to do that, then
Yeah.
it's a lot
Like
harder
if you're
to
too
stop.
insulated and not enough like public and open with people and stuff like that, it's easy to be propaganda because no one really knows you. But if you're
Yeah,
people know who you are, you're a figure of the community. It's kind of like, wait a minute, that guy's a racist. I had dinner with him. He's not a racist.
yeah, like
If you're in the
rebuild
public
a
eye,
natural elite,
yeah,
basically, kind of.
absolutely. I had no, I really, I don't think I had any disagreements with Hop on strategy. I was at 100% agreement. I think there's one point he said that I disagreed with, but I can't remember what it was, so I'm not going to bring it up. Remember, I was listening to it. I'm like, I need to write that down so I can bring it up later. And I didn't, and so, yeah, if I remember it later, I'll put a description in here of something that I probably disagree with. I can find it, but I'm probably not going to do that. Anything you want to add about the overall book? Before I have a few more questions I want to wrap it up with. Before we do that, anything you want to add?
I think the last thing I want to add is buy the book. Buy the book. Support Mises.
Link is in the description.
Mises Institute is kind enough to give it out for free. Buy it anyways. Buy it anyways. You'll be supporting the Mises Institute. If you're going to support any organization, any libertarian organization, the Mises Institute should be at the top of your list, and everything else down. And the Mengarian, scale preference of goods, Mises Institute first one. So
Nice.
Yeah, I bought the book, got one of the donation ones and donated. I gave it to a friend of mine, and so I'm like, I got my copy, I got the hardcover, and I donated the paperback to a friend who still I think hasn't read it yet. He's a monarchist who's never read Hopper.
Interesting.
He's completely skipped libertarianism. He went from like Republican to monarchist and never really read Hopper. I'm like, wait, he should be the monarchist. I just assumed he read Hopper and Rothbard and stuff. Nope, not at all. And so, he's a great dude. So, last two questions I have. Where you guys have read some Hopper books? Where do you rank this Hopper book on books you've read? I put it up to pretty high actually. Like I put it, I think number 2 because it kind of covers a lot of sayings, and I was really enjoyed it. I don't think it's better than Democracy God the Favorite, but it's definitely up there.
Yeah. Okay. I was not expecting to be ranking it, but just based off of what I've read, I'm actually going to probably put it in the middle of what I read. So number 1 being Democracy, the God That Failed, and the lowest one probably being I can't even think of one because I think my brain is like lowest Hoppa. Those two words can't go together. But I think I'm gonna have to say is lowest one is probably the Great Fiction. Or no, sorry. I'm gonna say actually private property or
private production and defense.
No.
The economics and ethics of private property.
No. It's his equivalent of economy, man, and state, basically. So like you had human action and man economy.
Is it like a theory of socialism, capitalism?
No. It's it's basically his comprehensive econ textbook. I think that's
I know what you're talking about.
Do I even know what that is? I don't know.
Yeah, I can't remember the title for whatever reason. I'd put this book somewhere in the middle, probably more towards the higher end because it's a general book that goes in depth enough, I think, but that generality loses a lot. So Hoppa is really good when he gets into specifics, and Democracy, the God That Failed is pretty general, but it's very specific. It's very much focused on the political philosophy under an economic lens, though. But still, the political philosophy and the development of government in the state. And then below that is the myth of of national defense for me,
Mm.
because that one is very specific too. And then below that, Getting Libertarianism Right, What Must Be Done. These are all very specific. So I think Hoppe's always at his best when he's more specific, and his worst books are the more general he gets.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, they're not books per se, they're
Yeah.
collections of essays. So if they're not focused, he wasn't sitting down to write one
Exactly.
book,
Yeah.
kind of. So I mean, it makes sense that like his focused book is at the top of your list. I think it would be like my third favorite. I mean, Democracy's my favorite. I think my second favorite, I need to reread it again, is The Economics and Ethics of Private Property.
That is a good one.
I mean, it's
That's
basically
also a
like
focused
the
one.
ethics of liberty, but with like argumentation ethics and all that.
Yeah.
So that's a good one. I think this is my favorite compilation of his essays. I really enjoyed, like, I don't really think about like early history that much, but just like early like primitive development was interesting to read about with the theoretical backdrop, not just like here's the facts of when cavemen developed, whatever. And then like after that would probably be, I mean, I like a lot of his other essays, like Getting Libertarianism Right is technically a collection of essays. Same with Great Fiction.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say it's like upper tier for me.
I think I put it in like probably third place, top three for sure. Here's the next question. I would say, because like I said earlier, it's a good introduction to Hoppe's work. At what point would you give this to someone? I wouldn't give this to a normal Republican. I would think I would at least. So at what point, if you read Plenty of Friend, at what point would you give them this book? Like if you're recommending 3 books for someone to read, at what point do you start recommending like this one specifically?
I guess it depends where they start. I've asked like Tho and like Jared, like, what book do I give to Hoppill someone? And it's always Getting Libertarianism Right, which I think makes a lot of sense. I've given that to some of my like very conservative friends, and I think they like some of it, at least. Yeah, it is interesting. This book is kind of like a bit of everything. Maybe it could be like a primer for Democracy, the God That Failed, because it includes like sprinkles of everything. So you're not just like reading like 5 chapters on why the system you've thought is the only way we can operate is like a sham. Like at least this way you're kind of like eased into it, and then you get some like interesting like economic framework. So I think I would maybe like even the second thing you give them from Hoppe, like it's kind of like a overview of his thought process, and it also includes why he thinks the way he does. Because if you just start with Democracy without like a framework of like either anarcho-capitalism or at least like minarchism, classical liberalism, I think some of it wouldn't stick well. Like the first time I read Democracy, I only agreed with like, I don't know, 70% of it. Like it made me really think, but I had to reread it before I like got back to it and was like, oh yeah, this is a great book. That same thing happened with me with Anatomy of the State, though. That was like the first thing I read from Rothbard because it was such a short book, and I was like, oh, this is weird. After I'd only known like Mises and Milton Friedman. So
yeah, so I'm actually really glad you asked this, because I'm working on a Substack article that is a reading list that puts books into intro, advanced, and then the expert, and then also I want to have a section on just like this type of person, give them this books and to red pill them and give them, so I would say my answer is kind of twofold. First, I would say this might actually be a book a first Hoppe book I would give to people, because I think it's a good overview, and then kind of gauge what they found most interesting and target the rest of my Hoppe recommendations off of that. So if they liked a lot of the political theory stuff, give them Democracy. If they like the stuff about war and stuff like that, give them Myth of National Defense. If they like the economic stuff and the development stuff, give them Ethics of Private Property and stuff like that. But also, I think if I'm going to target people too, though, something I'm gonna do is they're already pretty right wing. Definitely gonna give them this book. They're left wing. No, not gonna give them this.
Well,
book.
what book of Hoppe would you give to a left winger? Like, how would you
I would.
do that?
So
I don't think I would.
I
I
would.
mean, you can like maybe like do like a transition of like Mises or something, but
So
kind of
to the first book I would give to a left winger from Hoppe, if I was going to give one at all, which I think there are some cases you would, Myth of National Defense.
Mm.
Because left wingers, even when they're not fully anti-war, are sympathetic to it, and that book would create a really good mindset and kind of have them connect what they think about war and what they think about the military to the rest of government, because Hoppe does a really good job about doing that. And it would open the floodgates for them. Now, not every left winger is going to respond to it, because just by proxy of being on the left at all, you're kind of insulated from this kind of thinking just naturally, as someone who was a left winger and knows their mindset. Yeah,
I feel like you just find the thing that like it seems to be like the topic that people care about, they generally are not satisfied with the government on. So you kind of just have to like ease them in with that topic. Like my mom's like a left wing person, but she like is into like alternative nutrition stuff. So I'm just like, see, look how bad the FDA is, and then it's just like down the rabbit hole you go, kind of.
Nice.
Yeah, you really, when you recommend books to people, you want to really target it to what they care about, and because if you can convince them of that your position is correct on the issue they care about most, everything else will trickle down. You know, a good example of this, I have a friend who's far more on the authoritarian side of the right wing, and he was able to convince his left wing friend to be a full-on fascist, in fact, by all he did is he said fascism would solve the environmental problem, fascism would solve climate change. And
I mean,
that makes sense.
There
that makes
was,
sense. And he became a full-on right winger, like in a fascist himself. And I was like, huh.
I guess. Wow. I'm shocked.
People have these most people have one or two, maybe even three political pet issues. And if you can convince them that your ideology will solve for this, everything else trickles down. Everything trickles down, or you just get enough of them where your disagreements don't matter, because fundamentally they would put your regime, if you want to call it, in power. They would see, and your policies would trickle down, because their disagreements are probably going to be things that they don't care about as much. They're on, again, bringing up the Mengarian or hierarchy of preferences. It's going to be lower on that hierarchy, so they're going to care less.
Yep. Okay, last question. I wasn't asked, but we talked about recommending books to people. A normie Republican, like a BoomerCon normie Republican, what book would you recommend? It's not a Hoppe. What book in general would you recommend to them?
So, normie BoomerCon Republican.
My answer is Against the Left.
My
answer is Against the Left by Lee Walker. That kind of gets you Lee Walker, Hoppe, Mises, Waspa, all in one. And it's really, if you're on the right and you want to hate the left, this is the best way to hate. This is the book for hating the left. Like it's very easy read, very quick. Well, I think it's on 80 pages, but yeah.
You know what? Mine's gonna be a bit of a weird one. It's Raimondo's book on the right. I forgot the exact.
Reclaiming the American Right.
Reclaiming the American Right. Yes.
Marcel is coming on for this one.
Yes, great, because Marcel's the one who got me to read Reclaiming the American Right.
Nice.
But and the reason is because if you can redefine what it means to be right wing for them, if you can redefine what the right wing was, I think that'll trickle down and open them up to the other positions, and to being no longer a BoomerCon, and realizing just like wait a minute, the left has infected the right. The right that I am dedicating myself to is actually just the left. It is controlled opposition towards the left. And so I think that's a pretty good book too. I think there's some other ones too that would be pretty good.
What
Again,
about
have you read pit issues?
Have you read Vanishing Traditions by Paul Gartford yet? Have you read that at all? Pretty good. Basically, the entire book is about how neocons aren't really right wing and affected the right and cancel a lot of the good people on the right. Like it's a pretty good book.
I think though you can't go as hard into the neocon thing because these people don't even know that term exists.
Yeah,
they don't even know that
like,
there are different. Yeah, they don't even know that there's different right wing ideologies.
Yeah, I didn't until
it's just Republican.
Years ago.
Yeah, that you're just a Republican or you're not.
Yeah, and for me, I don't know. I mean, I guess it would depend what issue they care about. I mean, I think Against the Left and Getting Libertarianism Right are the two that have been recommended to me. But like, I'll give you an example. Like a conservative, like you kind of like play to the advantage of like of conservatives not liking Biden to like help them get in. Like, so one of my friends is now really concerned about inflation. He wasn't back in when money printers were going off in like March of 2020, but now that like Biden's in charge, now he's really concerned about inflation. So he's getting into like crypto and stuff. So I'm like, hey, you should read What Has Government Done to Our Money? Like something like that. Like it's an issue that they're now thinking about, and then they're more willing to read. So if you can find if they're critical of foreign policy, you could throw like Scott Horton or I don't know who else.
Yeah,
he's not right wing, but or if they're critical of monetary policy, you could go for like any of the monetary policy books.
So just to connect it back to the book really quick, please, because I think this comes back to Hoppe's strategy too, is that you've got to start at a very decentralized level, at the very lowest level, and tailor when you recommend books, tailor it to the person. That is how you can be subversion proof. That is how you can get them. And a lot of libertarians ask constantly, what can I individually do as a libertarian to help? And it's very, very simple. Give books, give podcasts, give whatever their preferred format is. My boss has a really good way of saying this, that in politics, you conform to the way that they want you to communicate with them. And tailor your message, tailor what you're doing to their specific needs and their specific cares, and you'll get them. You'll get them on board. Everything else will come naturally, or it won't matter the things you differ on at the end of the day, because the result is the same, especially with democratic systems, because you don't vote, or at least our democratic systems, you don't vote issue based, you vote for a person. And so, so if the best thing you can do is tailor to waking people up to their method. So not just books, but videos, YouTube, and all that. Because that's I mean, what convinced me of libertarianism and Hoppe and a lot of other things, or at least got me into it at first, was not books. It was videos. Libertarianism, it was an interview of Brian Kaplan on Dave Rubin. And for Hoppe in this vein of libertarianism, I saw True Dill Tom's video on Democracy, the God That Failed. And then that made me want to read the book. And that's what got me into it, is reading the book. So I wouldn't even have been at the book if it wasn't for a video, which I suggest going and finding that video if you can, because that's a really good one to, if somebody doesn't want to read a book, give them the video. They can listen to it, and it explains the book very well and is very good at convincing people. It's convinced a few people I know, giving them that video. So
nice. Well, I think that's about it. You guys go ahead and give your plugs. Where can people find you at?
I'll go for sure. So you can find me. You see my Twitter handle in the thing, but it's S and my last name Cartagena_BTC. I've written for Mises.org a bit, so that's just my name. That's about it. I mean, if you follow me on Twitter, if I move anywhere, I'll post it there. So just see me on Twitter, I guess.
Sounds good.
So for me, actually, if you just look up Repeal the 20th Century on Google, you will find my podcast. So you'll find me, my Spotify, my YouTube, all of those things. So I'm on Spotify, YouTube, Odyssey, Anchor, Twitter, Facebook, and Substack. So my Twitter is at Repeal the 20th. Facebook, just look up Repeal the 20th Century, and all other platforms, you can just look up Repeal the 20th Century, and it should be one of the first results. Even if you just do it in Google, you'll find me there. And if you want to look up my Mises stuff and my stuff at the Libertarian Institute, it's also on my Substack with links to those also. Or you can look up my name, Peyton Guzan. That last name is spelled Gouzien. Because you'll never get the spelling from just hearing it. But yeah, you can look that up and you'll find those as well. So
wonderful. So I gotta do a few announcements myself for the podcast going forward. But I think you guys both for coming on. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I'll see you guys later. Okay, guys. Thanks for listening. Great episode of another episode of Faith Living in Practice. Really enjoyed the guests. Make sure you follow them. Podcast is going on a little bit of a hiatus. I'm gonna do about a 3-week, maybe 4-week break. When I come back, though, I think the first book would be Managerial Revolution and then Reclaiming the American Right. So that's the plan when I come back. Still going to try to put some stuff out about Ostracomism. Probably gonna do an episode with Popular Liberty on that as well. But yeah, Faith and Me Practicing the Book Club will be taking a bit of a hiatus because I need the time to actually read the book. So anyway, thanks for listening. Have a good night.